WGLT's podcast 12,000 Bombs examines the election issue no one is talking about, nuclear policy. Experts discuss the existential threat and aftermath of what a nuclear war could look like, plus the legacy of nuclear testing.
Our government came here, they invaded our lands and our lives. They knowingly and willingly damaged us, and they have walked away for 79 years.
Subscribe to the 12,000 Bombs podcast from WGLT, part of the NPR network.
Hi, I'm Paul J. Aguilar, news editor at The Vidette, the student voice of Illinois State University and a reporter for WGLT. Welcome to Democracy's Future, a joint project between The Vidette and WGLT News. We hear from the students who will help chart the future of our democracy. On this episode of Democracy's Future, the threat of nuclear war is as high as it's been since the height of the Cold War, but neither candidate for president has a clear platform on nuclear policy. 12,000 Bombs is a WGLT podcast produced in partnership with ISU physics professor Matt Kaplan. Kaplan developed a seminar series bringing experts to campus this fall. Topics range from nuclear winter to arms control. In this excerpt of a new episode launching later this week, 12,000 Bombs host Lauren Warnicki speaks with ISU physics students Claire Campbell, Andy Santorelli, and Naomi Sato. They discuss how nuclear policy factors into how they may vote this November. Here's Campbell.
I think there kind of maybe is something that's said there in the silence of politicians, because a lot of the nuclear issue is an issue of perception. It's how are we presenting ourselves to the other people who have nuclear weapons, because we have nuclear weapons because other people have nuclear weapons, and they have nuclear weapons because we have nuclear weapons. So I wonder if there is something to that kind of silence on the issue, maybe saying like, if I ignore this long enough, maybe it will just disappear and go away.
It's an issue that should be brought up more because it's not, like Claire said, it's not going to go away. We can't just sit there and ignore it because it is a greater threat than ever. I mean, I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but a couple years ago, we were an inch away from nuclear war because Russia essentially planted a dirty bomb and said that Ukraine was about to use nuclear weapons. And they were going to use that as an excuse to use their nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Luckily, they were kind of called out, and it was luckily prevented, but we were extremely close because they planned this out. They planned this sort of conspiracy as an excuse to use their weapons against Ukraine.
Kind of like what both of you said, it comes back to, we don't see it a lot in the news. We don't see a lot with politicians and such. And I think that's the exact push that maybe we need to see, that people do need to talk about it, and that we as young people and the younger generation need to see that and think, oh, I shouldn't do that just because they're doing that. We can talk about this. We can do this and vote. We can use what we can do as people individually and vote and encourage other people to vote. You can't necessarily tell people what to vote for, but at least people should exercise that right to vote. Like what Andy said, like this kind of thing with, we were so close to, nuclear war, and people still think that the first and only bombs used were for Japan, and that's just not true. I think it all kind of comes back to, what do we know about this? And being ignorant is doing more harm. At least one thing you can do, as simple as it seems, is vote.
I don't know if either of you were able to vote in the 2016 election, but I think I bring a unique perspective there because I was in college at that time and I'm in college again at this time. It was so interesting back then to hear certain people and certain students talk about how they weren't going to vote because they either A, felt like they had no impact, or B, didn't like any officials and everything's bad, so I'm just going to not vote at all. Throwing away your vote is one of the worst things you can do, I think. I think it is essential as a U.S. citizen to exercise your rights as a U.S. citizen and go out and vote. And that's the most important thing individually. Going back to that conversation, what we can do individually is to vote. I think that mindset of not voting and abstaining from voting has kind of waned somewhat because it is such a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A chaotic climate, I suppose.
Do you think that that's changed since Joe Biden dropped out of the race? I feel like there was a bit of that sort of apathy that you're talking about, Andy, when Trump and Biden were the candidates, and people are like, well, I don't like either one of them, so I'll just stay home. Do you find that there's a difference between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, for example?
I have actually still seen a lot of this voter apathy among people my age. And I was not voting during the 2016 presidential election, so I can't really compare it to what my experience is.
Yeah,
with
maybe
others.
that's more my audience. The
Yeah.
people that I knew who didn't vote then are now like, oh, I need to vote.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe there was a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah.
If you didn't maybe vote in the 2016 presidential election, and if you weren't happy with the outcomes of that election, then it can kind of be a wake-up call saying, wow, maybe I could have done something to effect change towards something that is more preferable to me. But I think that a lot of people in my generation, for whom this is the first presidential election they can vote in, they kind of haven't had that wake-up call yet. They kind of are still seeing this issue as something that's, they're being forced to choose between maybe two candidates, neither of whom appeal to them. And I think that they kind of feel like their best move there is to just not vote. The best thing that you can do in this opportunity, in this election, is to just make it go the way that you would least hate. If you're not a fan of either candidate, you can still do something, and that is choose somebody that it won't make your blood boil to see at the inauguration in January.
I think for undergrads, right? I think one of the major sticking points with Kamala Harris is her stance on Israel. And so that applies directly to, the things that Dr. Lamb was talking about yesterday in terms of our unapologetic, uncompromising support of Israel. And there are many young Gen Z folks who are very pro-Palestinian, right? And feel like that a vote for Kamala Harris would be a vote for quote unquote genocide. But in thinking about the Iran deal and the just bubbling situation in the Middle East being not quite so clear cut as Israel and Hamas in Gaza, I wonder if, understanding the larger picture of that, if you would challenge that view of Kamala Harris being kind of a unilateral on that issue.
As people of a young generation, I think we all see that narrative. And I think ultimately it's like what Claire said. No one candidate, no one person for that matter is going to align with all of your beliefs. Whatever your viewpoints are, pick someone that most aligns with that. And if you choose that person, maybe they're not perfect. Neither of them are perfect. They're people. But ultimately it's like, not to be a pessimist, but you have to choose the lesser of two evils, right? Like we can't just not vote for one person because they have certain flaws, and that's true. That doesn't mean don't acknowledge them. That doesn't mean don't advocate for, productive change, but it also isn't an excuse to then be like, well, I'm just not going to vote then, because then you're just advocating for a different route to happen.
So do you think Chapel Roan should have endorsed somebody?
I think Chapel Roan has every right to abstain from any statements as an artist. She has her own personal life.
Touche.
I think it is really important that people consciously avoid being a single issue voter, and that you look at the bigger picture. If one issue is swaying you from voting for somebody, maybe rethink priorities, look at the alternative outcomes, and weigh those options. The world doesn't need to be black and white. In fact, the world is entirely gray. Like Naomi said, there's not going to be any one person that exactly aligns with your views. Your views are unique to you. There's not one person in the world, let alone a politician, that's going to align with you perfectly.
I am also curious to get your perspectives on another sort of really unique thing in this race, and that's kind of the mainline Republican Party not really endorsing Donald Trump, and that includes a lot of military folks who are involved in national security and military defense. Does that give you pause, or does that just feel like it kind of swims in the soup for you?
I think a lot of that issue of a lot of the Republican Party, a lot of people who have traditionally been Republican, not supporting Donald Trump, may come down less to an issue of policy, although I'm sure that does have something to do with it, and more to an issue of personality. As was discussed on the first episode of this podcast, Donald Trump is not known to be the most level-headed person. And that is certainly applicable when we're thinking about the fact that as president, he would have sole authority to authorize nuclear bomb use. But it also comes down to a lot of other things. And, part of nuclear weapons is relations with other countries. What kind of relations with other countries are you going to have with somebody who is very erratic, very hot-headed, things like that? And I think that maybe even though many outspoken Republicans, many people who are prominent in the Republican Party might agree with a lot of the things that Donald Trump is proposing as his policies, they might see a certain danger in the way that he presents himself, in the way that he deals with other nations, in the way that he would react in the event of a nuclear scenario or in the event of a threat of a nuclear scenario.
It's been very interesting, to say the least, and I'm sure it impacts people older than myself even more, who have been through more elections. This is my third, and even still, seeing Republicans not only not endorse their leading candidate, but endorse the opposing candidate. Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris, which is wild. That is unheard of, even to me, who has only seen a couple of elections. To somebody who has been voting for 20, 30 years, that is even more astounding. That doesn't happen.
It's significant, right? It feels like that matters for, and I don't know exactly why it matters, but it feels like because it is so different. It
feels important. Yeah. And it feels, I don't know, it feels different.
Yeah. And maybe it also signals just a cultural shift in that party, that
certainly
they've been running in parallel roads, and maybe now there's a fork.
Mm-hmm.
Liz Cheney has talked about on multiple occasions the possibility of a different party, right? Of a third party. And maybe that in the future gives people more choices. Who knows? Right?
Maybe.
I mean, maybe this is a sign that it's going in the right direction, that people are starting to question things from the inside, whether that's through their political affiliation or not. And maybe if it goes down this direction for a little longer, maybe that's a good thing. As long as people are consciously making choices and not just being, kind of a hive mind and following what everyone else is doing.
It's been an incredible lineup of speakers, and I wonder what your kind of key takeaways have been so far, what you're thinking about as a result of this, what you're maybe thinking about differently, so what are your kind of big tent, as Matt would say, your big tent ideas coming out of this series so far?
I think certainly a big idea for me has been pulling this out of maybe an isolated issue from the Cold War, maybe an isolated issue even from the bombing of Japan in World War II, and into something that is very much still present and is in fact continuing to affect people's lives, Americans' lives, in terrible ways. I think that it's been really important for myself, for the other attendees of the lecture series, for listeners of this podcast, to realize that we are kind of at a critical moment for nuclear weapons. Like, this is an issue that has been steadily escalating. We are at a great threat of nuclear war. A couple years ago in 2022, as Andy recounted, we were the closest to nuclear war that we've been in living memory. And I think that that's kind of something that a lot of people don't realize, just how present of an issue this is. And I really hope that by participating in this lecture series, by having this podcast out there, people do kind of realize that this is something that we need to be thinking about. This is something that we need to be affecting change in right now.
That was Claire Campbell, Andy Santorelli, and Naomi Sato with WGLT's Lauren Wernicke on WGLT's 12,000 Bombs podcast. You can catch all past episodes on the NPR app or wherever you listen. The full version of Lauren's talk with Claire, Andy, and Naomi comes out later this week. Our thanks to audio producer Bren McMonigal, WGLT Digital Content Director Ryan Denham, and WGLT News Director Eric Stock. Please give us your feedback on this series and let us know if there are certain issues you'd like us to explore. Email us at news@wglt.org. Subscribe to Democracy's Future on the NPR app or wherever you listen. Until next time, I'm Paul J. Aguilar. Thank you for listening.